Hello everybody, I hope you're doing extremely well. Again, welcome back to my channel. My name's Nick and today I'm here to discuss freehold versus leasehold. What's best, what's the pros, what's the cons, how does it work? We'll cover it in today's video. So first things first, quite simply, what is the difference between freehold and leasehold? Now if you go on Google, what it's going to turn around and tell you is that a freehold property is when you purchase the land the property sits on. So I literally mean the land below the property. So that's what the freehold is, that's the difference. If you're in a leasehold property, most likely it could be a flat. That means there's lots of properties over the ground you sit on. It can't be shared, therefore the freeholder puts a lease in place and you rent the ground from him. So the majority of houses and bungalows in England are freehold properties, so they were built and now own the land that they sit on. Now your responsibilities as a freeholder is to basically look after and maintain the inside, outside and grounds right up to the boundary that your property sits on. So if there are any issues at all, that's your liability to pay, which is of course the complete opposite to a leasehold property. So I think a really nice general rule of thumb to use for your leasehold properties is that when you open your flat or apartment door, anything on the inside, that's your responsibility. So I mean your decoration, your maintenance, any bills, your insurance, that's down to you to pay. However, a really nice bonus of owning a leasehold property is that anything on the outside of that, so it could be corridors, communal lounge, gardens, parking, maintenance to the roof, maintenance to the windows, that is not down to you to look after. You leave that to someone else, you just crack on, you go to work, you leave it to someone else and they'll sort it out for you. However, of course, it's a service and that service absolutely comes with a cost. The average cost being just over £1,000 in England. Now that price can vary, there's lots of things that can make that price go up or down. The main one I'd say being lifts. If you've got lift access to the building, they cost a lot to maintain. They need, I think it's half yearly inspections and that really does bump that price up. That being said, if you own a freehold property, you do still spend money on your garden and your windows and keep it all maintained anyway. You're probably looking at similar levels of money to be spent, it's just what works best for you. So another payment as a leaseholder that you're liable for is your ground rent. And it's quite simply, it does what it says on the tin. You rent the ground that the property sits on and that goes straight to the freeholder. And now before you ask, yes, you are liable to pay that and your service charge. So ground rent's not as much, it's normally only maybe a couple of £100 per year, but that absolutely should be factored in when purchasing a leasehold property. So a question I always seem to get asked is, when should I start to worry about the length of my lease? Now me personally, what I would absolutely do is keep a very keen eye on the property once it goes below 100 years of length of the lease. 100 years, 90 years, 80 years really isn't anything to be too concerned about. It's when you get to 70 and below, it can start to affect your mortgages. So there'll be less mortgages available. You still can get a mortgage at that level. You will need to use a mortgage broker. It will be more costly and there'll be much less products available to you. But it's something to bear in mind because that will also start to affect the value of the property. So that of course opens us up to the question of why does the value drop when the lease gets shorter? To answer that I'm going to use a scenario. Imagine you have a leasehold property that's on the market for £200,000. Now traditionally you might get maybe 30 inquiries, from that 20 viewings and maybe 3 or 4 offers. If you have 3 or 4 offers, you should expect for the property to be tied up within a percent or so of the asking price, and that could be either above or below. If that property say had 20-25 years left on the lease, it's now unmortgageable. So therefore, 2/3 of those people who were interested, 2/3 of the 30 that is, they can no longer afford to buy the property. So that leaves you with, if you round it up, 7 people left. If we're really lucky, if all 7 of those view, the odds on someone offering is about 1 in 7, so you should get 1 offerer. But what's the odds on that offerer still being there once they fully understand what they've got themselves into? If they make sure they're happy only buying a property with 20-25 years left on the lease, or if not, if they know a way to basically marry up an agreement between themselves and a freeholder, and if they're willing to put the time and money into doing so, I mean your odds are incredibly slim. Now in these scenarios before, I've seen a property at a value of 200 traditionally, we've agreed it for £80,000 to £90,000, so about £120,000 below market value. Again, another question we get asked is, in that case, why aren't there more people going around buying these properties for 80-90,000, spending money and doing the lease, so extending the lease to maybe 999 years, selling it and then reaping the rewards? And there are people who do that, but it's just incredibly risky. So you've got no guarantee. Normally there is an agreement to be made with the freeholder, but there's no guarantee there is agreement to be made. It costs a lot of money. You have to be at the property for a certain amount of years before you can even do that, which again is taking up a lot more of the life of the lease. And if you can't, obviously you've lost a huge chunk of money, but it's time, it's money, and it's a massive, massive risk. So what happens when the lease does expire? I mean, it's quite simple. It goes from a leasehold property then to a freehold property. So the freeholder, the gentleman who owns the lease at the top, they get the property back. So that does not matter if you've paid off your mortgage, if you've owned the property for 40, 50, 60 years, you put all your money into it, that doesn't matter. You're no longer the legal owner. It is owned by the freeholder. So further to that, there are restrictions that do come into play when owning a leasehold property. Now these can vary. I mean, your most typical ones that you get are to do with pets. So some of them don't allow pets at all. Some say you can own maybe a bird or a hamster, but not a cat or a dog. Some may be absolutely fine. You could have something which says you can't have any AST, so short hold tenancy, so it's no good for buy-to-let purchasers. It might have restrictions against holiday lets. It even might have restrictions against things like noise. So maybe you might have to have carpets, no wooden floors, to stop noise coming through to downstairs. Now the nice thing is that most owners these days do own a copy of the lease themselves, so you can ask your estate agent upon viewing if there are any restrictions in place. If they don't know at the time, they can obtain a copy of the lease, they can talk to you about it in a bit more detail and actually show you a physical copy, so before you spend any money on any legal fees, you know for sure what you can and can't do. So although leasehold and freehold are the two terms which are most commonly used with leases, there are three other terms which I'd like to quickly cover off with you if that's okay. The first one is a virtual freehold. So you might see on an advert that it's a virtual freehold property. But what does that mean? I mean, it is still a leasehold property. You've got the word freehold in there. Forget that, it's absolutely still a leasehold property. They use the word virtually because it might have 999 years left, so it's a very long lease. It will last you in the nicest way possible, your children, your grandchildren, and multiple generations to come. So it's virtually freehold to you. But you do still have to pay your service charge, you do still have to pay your ground rent, you do still have restrictions in place. So it's the exact same, it is a leasehold property, but it's virtually a freehold just because of sheer length of that lease in place. The second term is a flying freehold. So a flying freehold is quite simply where you have a freehold and it's either above or below someone else's freehold, so they're overlapping. Now 9 times out of 10 is absolutely fine. I mean, it could be a basement below a property that goes underneath someone else's, it could be a balcony, it could be a masonette maybe you're on the ground floor, someone else has stairs above you and they live above you. So that's a flying freehold. Normally it's fine if you get on well with the other person on the other side of the party wall, there's never any issues. However, if you don't get on with them, if there's some maintenance to pay, if the wall's cracking, if it's leaking, if it needs anything to be done to it, you have to split that fee, or you have to work a way to get that fee paid. That could go through solicitors, it could cost you time and money basically. It's a bit more of a risk. I would look for more legal advice for your solicitor on this one before you get into a flying freehold. So the next term is a share of freehold. So there's two different types of share of freehold, but they're both the same. It's when you obtain the freehold from the freeholder, so you or your building own the freehold. The first type is when there's 4 or less properties involved. So there's 4, we'll say flats for example. What they do, if it was 4, they split it equally, so 4 chunks of 25%, and you are now legally the freeholder, and that can get sold with the building as you decide to move on. The second type is for much larger properties, so it could be anything above 4 dwellings in the building. Now legally you can't split a freehold into any more than 4 portions, so the way to get around that is you set up a limited company and every single apartment has equal shares in that company. The freehold goes into that company and like before you still have the same control over the freehold. But obviously what this does mean is that you now have to do all the maintenance, you have to look after the property, the grounds, the roof, the windows, anything to do with the property, you're all liable to cover. So there we are, we'll leave it at that for now. I know it's quite a lot for you guys to digest with that video, but if you do have any questions at all, then just pop it in the comment section below. I'll absolutely get back to you. Alternatively, if you do want to speak to me over the phone or by email, my contact details are in the description as well. Please give us a thumbs up, please don't forget to subscribe, and we'll speak to you very soon. Thanks for watching, bye bye.